It's day 498 of the Ukraine war, and the war has continued unabated, even though it experienced a bump recently with the Wagner Group and the Prigozhin saga. Ukraine has directed more than 70 drone attacks, meanwhile, at Crimea, while Russia continues to target Ukraine. Russia has also said that threats to Russia from the U.S.-led NATO military alliance were growing. In this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at the latest developments of the Ukraine war, especially the fate of Ukraine's counteroffensive. Is it even still occurring, and whether there are any political solutions on the horizon, which should be the focus? Where is that going? First, let me introduce our guest for this edition of the Spotlight. Andrij Dobriansky, director of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, joins us from New York. Also joining us is Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst, who joins us from Raleigh, North Carolina. Welcome to you both. Andrij Dobriansky, let me first start with you. I'm not too sure what your thoughts are about what happened regarding the Wagner Group and Prigozhin and that incident, which was diffused in a matter of 24 hours. There was a lot that was made into it, and it still is, in terms of how this showed a weakened Putin, how this showed that Russia is obviously having problems from within. What are your thoughts on that, and why? What do you think about the fact that some say that was a lost opportunity in order to move and push more towards a solution to the conflict?
Well, while the rest of the world was concentrating on what was happening in Moscow, obviously my attention was what was happening in Ukraine. Last night, a horrible rocket attack, not only in the UNICEF Center cultural city of Lviv, the areas of Khmelnytsky, areas of Dnipro and Zaporizhia that have been bombed by Russian cruise missiles over the last week. Those are the areas that really need the attention. We just had a world-famous writer killed, one of 60 artists that have been killed by Russia since the full-fledged aggression in this ninth year of war, actually. So what we're talking about right now is really the ongoing breaking of international conventions and the slaughter of innocent Ukrainian lives. I'm focused on the humanitarian area south of the dam, as well as what would possibly happen once Russia blows up a part of the nuclear plant. Whatever happens in Russia, that's obviously for them to decide. Ukraine is not interfering in that business so long as Russia is doing their thing. However, they are on Ukraine's sovereign territory, and that's the priority for Ukrainians right now.
Okay, Ray McGovern, I was going to ask you a question, but I'm going to ask you to react to what our guest from New York has said.
Well, in answer to your original question, the Prigozhin thing is sort of like a sideshow. I think it will be taken care of. There is some lingering doubt on my mind as to what he's doing roaming around Petrograd or St. Petersburg and Moscow. But I think that's going to be okay. In other words, the Wagner Group will be taken care of and be given profitable employment. Now, your other guest suggested Zaporozhye and repeated Zelensky and Budanov's charge that the Russians would blow up Zaporozhye. It's strange credulity. These are the same people who said that Russia blew up its own pipeline under North Sea. These are the ones that are saying Russia blew up its own dam there near Kherson. And now they're being accused preemptively of causing this disaster by causing radioactivity to flow out of Zaporozhye. One needs to be a little skeptical about these things. I was really worried that this was going to happen a day or two ago. I still worry a little, but less. And let me tell you why it's less. Prominent West European, that is NATO allies, are reported to have leaned on Zelensky not to let that happen. Well, wait a second. Leaned on Zelensky? I thought the Russians were going to do it. Give me a break. This is all the earmarks of a false flag. And so it made sense for these West European allies to say, look, we know what the game is. We know what blackmail is. Don't do it, especially before the NATO summit in Vilnius. Now, will Zelensky be permitted to go to the NATO summit? I suppose he will, but he'll walk in with a cloud over his head because, people don't like to be mousetrapped. People don't like to be double-crossed. people don't like to be taken to the cleaners. So this was very important. You want radioactivity in Poland and Moldova and Romania? No, nobody wants that. So I think that maybe Zelensky has played a weak hand here in structuring or trying to structure an attack on Zaporozhye that he could blame on the Russians.
Andrij Dobriansky.
Yes, Zaporizhia is the name of the oblast, it's the name of the city, and that's the name that Ukraine has enshrined in its constitution, Zaporizhia. After that fact, I really don't know where any of these conjectures come from. I was on the ground when the dam was blown up. I spoke well with both Ukrainian emergency services who are having their people shot at from the Russian side when they were rescuing people, as well as the chief rabbi of Ukraine who went down there, numerous international NGOs. There was just a report out from the United Nations about the people who are getting shot at while they're trying to rescue people. And that is unfortunately what's in store for any kind of event that might happen around the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. That is more likely than not to affect the ground, as did the dam explosion, for decades to come. And therefore, Ukraine will do whatever it can to prevent that tragedy, not least of which is working with the IAEA. It is not the Russian side that works with this, with the IAEA, but Ukraine is working with the IAEA to get more and more access to them on the ground. Unfortunately, Russia keeps blocking every request that IAEA has.
Well, actually, facts are facts. Russia has not blocked the IAEA inspection teams coming in there. As a matter of fact, they have escorted them into the power plant area there under fire from whom, I wonder? Now, okay, Zaporizhia, I've got that right. But now, why would Zelensky say that the Russians are sure to attack Zaporizhia when there's no reason in God's heaven why the Russians would do that? Why would he say that? Well, I'm glad he stopped saying that, because I'm a little sick and tired of him telling these tall stories. What I'm saying now is that Ukraine is losing badly on the battlefield, and NATO has to contend with what NATO does now. Does it throw good money after bad, as we say, or do they recognize the realities and stop the bloodletting? That's what needs to stop the bleeding, just as you do in first aid. So I think people will be open after the counteroffensive, so highly advertised, peters out. People might be open to discussing what's next, but that would require a change in heart, not only in Kiev, but of course on the part of the puppet master of Zelensky in Washington.
Andrij Dobriansky, how badly is Ukraine losing the counteroffensive?
It can't be losing if it's advancing kilometers every day. It's done that around the city of Bakhmut. It's done that across the river from Kherson. It's done that in Zaporizhia, across Dnipro, and up towards the Kharkiv area. Even with over 100 bombing attacks through drones and cruise missiles against the Sumy Oblast, those potential attacks have been brushed away. And again, Ukraine has been gaining kilometers of ground on a daily basis, with more and more prisoners of war being captured. We just had a report this morning on American News of journalists interviewing the people that have been captured. The situation on the ground is that Ukraine is advancing, and that we will see those advances continue without any change in Russia's policy.
I started out the intro, Ray McGovern, citing the day, 498 days of this war. And I'm wondering, based on what our guest there from New York is saying, how many more days does Ukraine need in order to move forward and make advances? I mean, it's one thing to, I guess, work against the one that is attacking it, which would be Russia, but it's another thing to make advances. And facts on the ground don't show the advances the way that our guest there in New York has made. Maybe you can explain and elaborate more on that, if you agree.
Well, there's no point, I think, in debating this today. Check with me in a week or so. So far, the Ukrainians have been able to make no substantial advances, and their losses, both in personnel and equipment, have been staggering. So that's why I appeal for a ceasefire. We have to stop this bleeding, this unnecessary carnage. And the only way to do that is to say, okay, we'll make a deal. And, you know, if you go back to the reasons for all this, and you go back to the Minsk Accords, those are the ones that with a full UN Security Council approval, indicated that France and Germany would oversee the Ukraine, giving a portion of autonomy to the Donbas republics, Donetsk and Lugansk. It didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Angela Merkel admitted why it didn't happen in December, and this is what she said. The Minsk Agreement was an attempt to give time to Ukraine, and they used that time to become stronger, as we see today. It was clear to all of us that it was a frozen conflict and the problem hadn't been solved, but that is precisely what gave Ukraine more time. 7 years to be trained up and to equipped as a NATO fighting force. That is behind all this. There was the expectation of a Ukrainian offensive into Donbass in February, March of 2022, and that's one reason why Putin thought he had no other option than to go in there.
Andrij, do you have a response to Ray McGovern?
I don't think that anybody in this discussion agrees that a preemptive war is something that should happen. So it defies logic to say that somebody had a reason to break international law and commit a war crime. But in terms of what has happened, there was no UN Security Council convention about what was happening in Ukraine. In fact, Ukraine wasn't supplied with NATO weapons. It received weaponry right at the very end of 2021, leading into 2022, as the Russian buildup occurred on its border. It did not receive more than javelins as far as lethal weaponry in the year prior to that. And it is only after the invasion of Ukraine, the full-fledged invasion, that again follows on the 9-year war, which was a hot war. It was not a cold war. There were people dying every day. I know that because I traveled there. I talked to the people there. I have seen the damage that has happened over the last 9 years. And it is not something that was forgotten by the people of Ukraine, nor by its allies that are going to be meeting in Vilnius next week. And we fully expect to hear an invitation from the NATO allies finally for Ukraine to receive that invitation to stand alongside them, as it has led the way really over the last 9 years in defending democracy throughout Europe.
All right, Ray McGovern, since our guest there talks about this summit that's going to take place, our meeting, or I'm not too sure how many they have had, but they sure have had a lot of them in the past few weeks. One of the things is about Ukraine's membership. Why are there such divisions over that?
Well, technically speaking, Ukraine isn't ready for membership. There are strict requirements. One of them is to be a democracy. Now, Zelensky has just postponed elections, ex cathedra. In other words, an edict. I postpone elections. Oh, well, you could say, well, there's a war going on. Well, there's a war going on in the United States during the Civil War, and Lincoln was not able to suspend elections. There are all kinds of repressive tactics going on in the Ukraine that really defy the definition of democracy. So now what will happen in Vilnius? Well, I think they know enough now about the background. I hope that the other guest is not suggesting that the UN Security Council did not officially approve unanimously the Minsk Accords, which Germany, France, and Poroshenko in Ukraine violated willy-nilly. I'm glad that he speaks of firing and wounding and so forth in Ukraine, because 14,000 people were killed in Lugansk and Donetsk after the Minsk Accords up until 2022. That's really bad. Now, was that reported? Not so much in the Western press. So what I'm saying is there was an uptick in firing, in artillery firing, by about 300% back in the late or the beginning of February 2022. That and other things were reason enough for the Russians to be very, very scared and wondering whether there's going to be an offensive with these NATO trained and armed troops into the Donbass, where most of the people are Russian speakers.
All right, I'm sure you have a response. Go ahead, Andrij.
Let me just clarify, there was no UN Security Council resolution. This was a resolution, sorry, this was a commitment by several states together outside of the UN to advance diplomacy between Russia and Ukraine. After Russia violated the first agreement very blatantly, that was agreed to in Minsk. In terms of what happened after that, the facts are just completely wrong. I do know the number of people who have died because I have been at those church services. I have been at command centers in Ukraine. So I fully understand that the number of thousands that is cited by the enemy of Ukraine happened in the first year and a half of the war in the East. And those people were buried with honor throughout Ukraine, not in the after the signing of the Minsk Accord. Those were at most a few hundred every year. So the thousands that are referred to are not between the last years, but at the beginning of the war, when Russia first violated Ukraine's sovereign territory. And included in that is just the most recent attack, wherein the United Nations has verified that 136 children were killed by Russian missile attacks, that 518 children were maimed just until the end of 2022, that 91 children in schoolhouses and other places are used as human shields by Russian forces, making sure that on the Security Council for the first time, a permanent member and a sitting member of the UN Security Council has been listed in the Secretary General's report about children in armed conflict, that Russia is a party that harms children in conflict. So that's what is actually happening and has happened over the last 9 years.
Ray McGovern.
Well, let me go back here and make sure that we're understanding each other correctly. It is fact that the UN Security Council formally, unanimously endorsed the Minsk Accords of 2015. Under those accords, the Donbass was to be given a measure of autonomy. France, Germany, and Ukraine used that to buy time to make sure that the Ukrainian armed forces were better. That is fact. Now, you're going back to 2014, okay? You should recognize that there was a coup, an illegal coup.
That is not true. That is not true.
Against the duly constituted president of Ukraine. His name was Yanukovych. He was chased out of the country, and the people who came in, first thing they said was, we're not going to allow Russian to be an official language. The second thing they said was, we're going to make sure Ukraine becomes part of NATO. Now, what did the Russian speakers do? They said, we don't want this coup regime. And the people in Crimea said, we don't either. Crimea was annexed to Russia. The Donbass, well, Ukraine sent troops starting in March of 2014 out to the Donbass to suppress the people who were saying, we don't want the coup regime. And that's the beginning of the story. The 14,000 that were killed started then, to be sure, but went through the UN Security Council approval, went all the way down to 2022 when the invasion occurred, and the Russians had, frankly, as Putin himself has said, run out of patience with the duplicity exercised by the Western side.
Again, I am hearing an acceptance of preemptive war. My colleague on the other side here is saying that Russia has the right to a preemptive war against Ukraine, which is what happened in Ukraine in February of 2014 when Russian forces occupied the Crimean Peninsula, killing people in the process. There was no coup, as my colleague who speaks on behalf of Russia at the Security Council, and I well know that speech that he gave was also full of falsehoods. But in this case, once again, repeating the falsehood that instead of a duly certified vote by the Parliament of Ukraine, which had been put in place, even members of the party of the president who had fled Ukraine, members of that party voted to elect the chairman of the Verkhovna Rada, the Parliament of Ukraine, as interim president of Ukraine until elections could happen. And we well know that Russia attacked Ukraine, and then what happened after that fact was actually an armed uprising in the eastern parts of Ukraine, where we saw state buildings taken over by armed insurrectionists, and only then was not an army sent, but local people took up arms from across Ukraine People that I know personally, butchers, bakers, people who are not soldiers, came to defend their sovereignty. And that's what happened. There was no coup from the outside because everything that happened was live streamed, was put on live for the rest of the world to see. And we saw what happened, which was a duly verified parliamentary vote to go step by step once the president of Ukraine had fled in the first time in history.
All right, we're going to go ahead, but then we're going to move on to another topic. Go ahead.
Sure, just briefly say that, there's a saying, the revolution will not be televised. Well, this coup was put on YouTube 2.5 weeks before it happened, the 4th of February, 2014. The plotters are Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, and our ambassador in Kiev. They were plotting. They named the people who would be the new. Matter of fact, that when the ambassador said, "Oh, the EU might not like this," Nuland said, "I don't know if I can say this." She said, "F the EU," okay, and then she apologized for saying that. So it's very genuine. That's why people call it the most blatant coup in history. You really have to recognize for what it was, because that's where it all started.
All right, we just have a little bit of time left here. Andrij, I want to ask you, what Ukraine wants from Russia is that it must leave every inch of its territory. Zelensky has said that on a number of occasions, obviously, including the 4 regions and the Crimean Peninsula. Now, my question to you is, when you take a look at what's happened to Ukraine, why doesn't Ukraine not leave that alone and end the war and stop what's going on?
Ukraine cannot stop being violated. Only the violator can stop violating it. What has happened is numerous war crimes, as I have cited during this discussion: the harming of children, the sexual violence against women as old as 82, against children as young as 4, by Russian forces on Ukrainian territory, and that happens anywhere a Russian occupying force outside of its border is operating. Okay. We began this discussion with what happened with Prigozhin and the Wagner Group just this past weekend. The rest of the world was finally able to initiate additional further sanctions against the Wagner Group for the war crimes it has committed in Syria, in Africa, around the world. And that is the exact type of violator we are talking about.
30 seconds to you, Ray McGovern, in closing. Whatever you'd like to talk about to close this off.
Yeah. Well, let me suggest that if Andrij feels so clearly about the need to pursue this carnage, that he sign up and join those of his friends at the front, together with the young people and the very old people who are trying to do the impossible, and that is to face this juggernaut, which has been building now for a year and a half, and which they can't defeat. Okay. So they ought to recognize that and stop the bleeding, for God's sake.
Thank you, Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst. Thank you so much, Andrij Dobriansky, director of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight.